All right, picture this, on the deck of this huge aircraft carrier out in the Pacific, right? It's 1945, victory in Europe, that's on the horizon. But out here in the Pacific, the war, it's still raging on. All of a sudden, alarms, they're blaring. You look up and you see the plane, but it's not dropping bombs.
Oh, no.
This plane, it's aiming itself right at your ship. And this isn't some Hollywood movie, right? This was the reality, this terrifying reality for the British Pacific Fleet as they battled this new kind of enemy, the Kamicazi. Yeah, it's a part of the Pacific War that we don't often hear about.
Right.
But the source material you've brought in today, these firsthand accounts, I mean, they really do bring that experience to life. They really do. And, I'll be honest, before diving into this, I always thought of the Pacific Theater as mainly an American fight. But the scale of the British involvement, I mean, the sheer size of their Pacific Fleet, it's amazing.
Yeah, it was a massive undertaking. By 1945, the Royal Navy, they had assembled their largest fleet ever. We're talking 4 battleships, 6 large aircraft carriers, 15 smaller escort carriers, and over 750 aircraft.
Wow, and yet it's sometimes called the Forgotten Fleet, right? Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. It's probably a combination of things. The American forces, well, they were vast. And their contributions, well, they were undeniable. And maybe back in Britain, the focus was shifting towards rebuilding after the long war in Europe. But whatever the reason, these men, they fought a brutal, crucial part of the war. And they deserve more attention, for sure.
Absolutely. And they faced a challenge unlike any other, these kamikaze attacks, these suicide pilots deliberately crashing their planes into Allied ships. It's hard to even imagine.
It was a completely new type of warfare, one that really tested the limits of courage and resilience. Just try to imagine that psychological pressure on those sailors and airmen, knowing that the enemy, they weren't just trying to defeat them, they were trying to die in the process.
Yeah, it must have felt like an unstoppable force. But the source material we're looking at today, it mentions an unexpected advantage for the British, their steel carrier decks.
Oh, that's right. The American carriers, they had wooden decks. You see, they were designed for a different kind of naval battle, launching their own planes to intercept enemy aircraft before they could get close. But those wooden decks, they were extremely vulnerable to kamikaze hits. The British carriers, on the other hand, they had these armored steel decks.
So while those decks would get incredibly hot
Yeah.
and uncomfortable for the crews, they could actually withstand a kamikaze strike better.
In many cases, yeah. Repairs that would take an American carrier months at a shipyard could be patched up on a British carrier like within an hour. They would literally sweep up the debris and get right back to launching planes. There was even an American liaison officer who was serving on a British carrier, and he remarked on this. He said it was like 2 entirely different wars.
Wow, that's incredible. But even with that advantage, facing those suicide attacks day after day, that must have taken an immense psychological toll.
Oh, absolutely. It's really hard to overstate the terror that must have just induced. Let's consider Keith Quilter for a second. He's one of the pilots featured in these accounts. He flew from HMS Formidable, and he had multiple harrowing encounters with kamikazes. For example, on May 4th, 1945, he was actually sitting in his Corsair, right there on deck, ready for takeoff, when a kamikaze attack hit.
So he was right in the thick of it. What happened?
Well, he barely had time to scramble out of the cockpit and get below deck. Before the carrier was hit, many of the aircraft on deck, they were engulfed in flames. There were casualties, just chaos everywhere.
And yet they were back in action within an hour. That resilience is just astounding.
It is. It really does speak volumes
Yeah.
about the determination of these men, their commitment to the mission. They patched up the deck, they put out the fires, and they continued the fight. But Quilter's story and his brushes with death, they don't end there.
This is where we get to the American submarine.
Exactly. This happened later. In July of 1945, Quilter was part of a squadron attacking the Japanese mainland when his wingman was shot down.
Oh, wow.
And during the search, Quilter's own plane, it took damage.
So he had to ditch in enemy territory.
Right into the harbor of a Japanese city. He managed to get out of the plane and inflate his dinghy. But Japanese boats, they were already converging on him.
He must have thought that was it.
He did. But then he spotted another ship coming into the harbor, an American submarine. And they were able to pull him aboard. And thanks to Quilter's directions, they were able to rescue his downed wingman as well.
What an incredible
Oh,
incredible story of survival against all odds. And the source material you brought in, it mentions another pilot from Quilter's squadron, Chris Cartilage. He was one of the first British pilots to attack the Japanese mainland,
he
right?
was, and like Coulter, I mean,
Yeah.
he had his share of dramatic experiences during a raid on a Japanese airfield. His plane was hit, and he had to ditch in the water. He managed to escape through the canopy
Yeah.
just before the plane sank.
It's amazing that anyone survived these kinds of encounters. Did the pilots have any way of knowing that
Yeah.
they were facing kamikaze pilots specifically, or was it
Yeah.
just another enemy plane? You know, the chaos of battle.
Well, from these accounts, it seems like they often didn't know until it was too late. They were trained to engage any enemy aircraft, and in the heat of the moment, there wasn't always time to distinguish, between a conventional attack and a suicide mission.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really does put you in their shoes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Trying to make these split-second decisions with
Yeah.
with life or death consequences,
Mhm.
never knowing if the next plane you see
Yeah.
is going to try and take you down with it.
Absolutely. And this brings us to another important point that's highlighted in these accounts: the layered defenses that the British Pacific Fleet developed to counter the kamikaze threat. It wasn't just about the resilience of their ships.
So it's more than just hoping to survive a direct hit.
Much more. They adopted this multi-pronged approach. First, they tried to destroy the kamikazes before they even got close to the fleet. This meant striking Japanese airfields, disrupting their operations, and limiting their ability to launch attacks.
So taking the fight to them, so to speak.
Exactly. But of course, some kamikazes would inevitably get through. And that's where the second layer of defense came in: fighter aircraft. British and American fighter squadrons. They would patrol the skies around the fleet, trying to intercept the kamikazes before they could reach their targets.
Like a desperate aerial game of cat and mouse.
Very much so. And the final, and often the most harrowing layer of defense was the ships themselves. British carriers and battleships. They were just bristling with anti-aircraft guns, manned by crews who knew their lives depended on their accuracy and speed.
I mean, imagine the pressure on those gunners.
Yeah.
Just seeing these planes hurtling towards them, knowing that they had one chance to stop them.
It must have been terrifying, and tragically, despite their skill and bravery, many kamikazes did get through. The accounts we're looking at today, they detail the devastating damage that these attacks inflicted: the fires, the explosions, the loss of life.
And it wasn't just about physical damage, was it? I mean, you mentioned the psychological impact of facing an enemy willing to die. Did the source material touch on how the crews coped with that constant fear, that sense of impending doom?
It did. There are several passages that offer a glimpse, into that psychological strain. Many of the sailors and airmen, they talked about the importance of camaraderie, of relying on each other for support. There's even a sense of dark humor in some of the accounts, like a way of coping with the unimaginable stress.
Finding ways to laugh in the face of death. It's both heartbreaking and inspiring.
Absolutely, and this brings us back to Chris Cartilage. Sadly, I recently attended his funeral. He was one of the last surviving kamikaze hunters, a direct link to this incredible chapter of history.
Wow, to have lived through that, carried those memories. You mentioned earlier that he was court-martialed at one point during his training. What was that about?
Well, apparently he crashed his Corsair into the rudder of another aircraft during takeoff.
Oh, that sounds serious.
It was. But what makes the story even more remarkable is that he didn't report the incident immediately. He was anxious to go on a date with this young woman he had met, and he didn't want to jeopardize his evening.
So he put romance ahead of military discipline. That's quite a story.
It is. Luckily for him, his superior officer was understanding. He recognized Cartilage's potential as a pilot, and he didn't want to lose him, over a youthful indiscretion.
It's a good reminder that even in wartime, even in the face of extraordinary danger, life and love, they find a way.
It certainly speaks to the resilience of the human spirit.
Now, shifting gears slightly, it's important to acknowledge that the British Pacific Fleet's involvement in the Pacific War, it wasn't solely driven by the desire to defeat Japan. There were significant political considerations at play as well.
You're referring to Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
And his vision for Britain's post-war role on the world stage. Exactly. Remember, by 1945, Britain had been at war for years. They'd suffered heavy losses, both in terms of human life and economic power. Churchill was acutely aware that the global landscape was shifting, and he was determined to ensure that Britain retained its influence.
So joining the fight in the Pacific was partly about demonstrating
Yeah.
that Britain was still a major player, even after all they'd been through.
Precisely. It was a way of reminding the world that Britain was still a force to be reckoned with, capable of projecting military power, far from its shores. Churchill saw the Pacific War as an opportunity to regain some of the prestige and influence that had been lost during the early years of the conflict, especially in Asia, where the Japanese had captured vast swaths of British territory.
It's fascinating to consider how those political calculations
At highest levels.
played out on the ground for the sailors and airmen of the British Pacific Fleet.
Indeed. They were fighting for their lives, for their country, but also for a place in the post-war world. Their sacrifices, their courage were instrumental in shaping the world we live in today.
Speaking of sacrifice,
Yeah.
we've talked about the impact of the kamikaze attacks on the Allied forces, but we haven't really delved into the Japanese perspective. What motivated those young men to become kamikaze pilots? What led them to believe that sacrificing their lives was the only option?
Well, it's a complex and tragic question. Many of these pilots were teenagers,
Yeah.
barely out of high school.
Well-
They were indoctrinated with this fanatical devotion to their emperor and their country. They were taught that dying for the emperor was the highest honor, that it was a way to redeem themselves and their families from the shame of defeat.
It's difficult to comprehend that level of indoctrination. To convince young men that throwing their lives away is an act of heroism.
It does highlight the insidious power of propaganda,
Right.
the way in which governments can manipulate their citizens, especially in times of war. It's a chilling reminder that the human cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield.
And it underscores the importance of critical thinking,
Yeah.
of questioning narratives, especially those that glorify violence and sacrifice. But returning to the British and Commonwealth pilots, beyond the constant threat of kamikaze attacks,
Yeah.
what were some of the other challenges they faced, serving in the Pacific?
Well, the conditions on board, those British carriers were notoriously harsh, those stale decks.
Yeah.
While offering some protection against kamikazes, they turned into ovens. Under that Pacific sun, there was no air conditioning. The humidity was stifling, and the living quarters, well, they were cramped and crowded.
It must have been incredibly difficult to maintain morale and fighting spirit under those circumstances.
It was a constant test of their endurance. They were exhausted. They were homesick, and they were constantly facing the threat of death. But they persevered, driven by a sense of duty, camaraderie, and the hope of eventually returning home.
It's a testament to their resilience, their ability to adapt and overcome, incredible adversity.
Absolutely. And their experiences provide valuable insights into the human capacity for courage and endurance. They faced a terrifying enemy. They endured brutal conditions, and they emerged from the war with stories that deserve to be heard, remembered, and honored.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how these experiences, shaped their lives after the war.
Yeah, many of them struggled, to readjust to civilian life.
I can imagine.
They'd witnessed horrors. I mean, horrors most people can't even, imagine. And some suffered from what we now call PTSD.
I mean, back then there wasn't much awareness, right, of the psychological effects of war.
Exactly. They were often expected to just, bury their trauma.
Yeah.
And get on with life.
That must have been incredibly difficult.
It was, but despite the challenges, I mean, many of them, they did go on to lead, fulfilling lives. They built families, they pursued careers, and they contributed to their communities.
It really speaks volumes about their strength, right, and their resilience.
It does. Their stories, they don't end with the war. Their experiences, they continue to shape them.
Yeah.
And those around them.
So as we reflect on the experiences of these kamikaze hunters, what are some key themes that emerge for you?
Well, one is the sheer terror of facing an enemy who is willing to die to achieve their objectives. It was a new kind of warfare that had a profound impact on the Allied forces.
And yet they found ways to adapt and overcome.
They did. They developed new tactics. They relied on their training and their comrades, and they drew on their inner reserves of courage and resilience.
Their stories, I mean, they really are a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure, even in the face of unimaginable horror.
They are, and their experiences offer valuable lessons.
Yeah.
about courage, sacrifice, and the importance of remembering those who served.
It's also a reminder that history is multifaceted. You know,
Hmm.
we tend to focus on the major players and the battles, but there are countless stories of bravery and sacrifice that deserve to be remembered. The British Pacific Fleet, they may be the forgotten fleet, but their contribution was significant.
It was. Their story deserves to be told and understood. It's a vital part of the larger narrative of World War II.
This deep dive has given us so much to think about. What stands out to you most from these accounts?
Well, for me, it's the resilience of the human spirit. These men, I mean, they faced an enemy unlike any other, an enemy who embraced death as a weapon. Yet they continued to fight, to fly, to put their lives on the line
Right. So
for their country and their comrades.
it's a powerful reminder of the human cost of war and the enduring strength
Yeah.
that we can find in ourselves and each other.
It is. And it underscores the importance of peace, of striving to resolve conflicts through diplomacy and understanding.
This has been quite a journey. Thanks to the source material you shared, we've gained a whole new perspective on a truly pivotal moment in history.
It was my pleasure. These stories are important and they deserve to be shared.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. If you found this exploration of the British Pacific Fleet as compelling as we did, be sure to subscribe to the deep dive. We explore a new topic every week, bringing you insightful summaries and captivating details from the sources you provide. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those deep questions.